Of course, the grand opening this weekend, and we are glad to have with us some guests representing the National Museum of the Great Lakes, Toledo's own. It's a big, important name. It feels good to say, but it's right here in Toledo. Executive Director Chris Gilchrist with us. Also, Carrie Soden, she is the Archaeological Director there, and Anna Collin joining us as well, Development Director for this National Museum of the Great Lakes. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Chris, the kickoff this weekend. Let's talk a little bit about getting this thing off the ground. As I said, we were out there, got a sneak preview before people were let in this weekend. But talk about the planning, all that went into trying to bring this to Toledo.
You know, it's been about 12 years in the making.
No kidding.
Yeah, our facility in Vermilion, Ohio was landlocked and too small to develop the kind of museum that we really wanted to develop. And so we began looking at different sites around the Great Lakes. And in 2008, we began seriously looking at Toledo. And 6 years later, we're opening the National Museum of the Great Lakes.
So for people who didn't know, this is not so much a relocation as it is what would you call it?
Well, the museum and the exhibits are entirely new. Nothing you will see in Toledo you would have ever really seen in any context in Vermilion.
Yeah.
Our property was so small, our galleries were in an older house. We couldn't display anything that really kind of brought to life the history of the Great Lakes as we've done in Toledo. So if you saw us in Vermilion, you can see us in Toledo, and there's no comparison to what you would see.
Anna, I'm interested when something like this is being put on the drawing board, and you're trying to come up with, let's feature this here, let's put this here, how do we lay it out on the floor? How much effort and work is going into figuring out? I mean, when somebody walks in there, you go into Henry Ford, I mean, there's a plan. There's a plan to how people see stuff, where people see stuff. Same thing here?
Absolutely, and honestly, Carrie Soden here, she was instrumental in actually organizing all of that, so she'd probably be better to talk about
talk about
the
that
specifics.
a little bit.
It's a lengthy process. We started interviewing design firms probably well over 3 years ago, and sat down for our first design meeting in June 3 years ago this year, and that's how long it's taken. And you look at the space, you have all of these workshops to talk about what it is that you want to get out of the museum, and then they start laying things out, and it's a back and forth between us and the designers as to the beauty of the display, but also the history and the requirements that we're trying to make happen there.
This is a national museum focused on the Great Lakes, so people are not going to see anything like this up in the Sioux. They're not going to see it in Traverse City. They're not going to see it anywhere in Wisconsin, correct?
Yeah, our approach is different than many of the museums, well, all of the museums around the Great Lakes, in that we're looking at national stories and how they play out on the Great Lakes. The Industrial Revolution, the military life on the Great Lakes, the westward movement of peoples, the big questions in American history and how they play out on the Great Lakes. And we don't just cover one small area. This is not the Western Basin of Lake Erie Museum. We cover all of the lakes with artifacts and stories, and we cover a wide variety of topics, whether it's commercial fishing, whether it's commercial shipping, whether it's lighthouses, shipwrecks, life-saving, industry. We take a broad swipe at American history and see how it is explored and played out on the Great Lakes. And what people will find is the Great Lakes have had a tremendous impact on our nation's history and our continent's history.
Anna, when you look at, we were talking before we came on today about kind of the maritime theme in Northwest Ohio for the last couple of years. We've got a charter school dedicated to maritime. We've got the Titanic exhibit at Imagination Station just has been very, very popular. People are drawn to this history.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's interesting, there's actually a lot of connections between even the Titanic, the boat, and with the James M. Schoonmaker, which is part of our experience. We have the National Museum of the Great Lakes, of course, and then we also have the James M. Schoonmaker Museum ship, which most Toledoans will remember as the Willis B. Boyer, which was down at International Park. As part of this process, when the Great Lakes Historical Society chose to come to Toledo, that was part of the link in there, is that they would move the ship down and it would become part of the National Museum of the Great Lakes. It went through tremendous renovation construction and was moved down, and it's a huge asset to us now as this museum.
Why do you kind of connect the Titanic history and what we're seeing in this museum?
You know, there's been lots of books. I think every community has published a book that says the Titanic and our local connection, because it's such a seminal event in American and European history.
Yeah.
But there are some connections in the sense that when both boats were launched, the Titanic was the largest passenger vessel in the world, and the Colonel James M. Schoonmaker museum ship then was the largest bulk freighter in the world. And they were 1912 and 1911. They were gave birth. They were birthed at roughly the same period. The Colonel James M. Schoonmaker actually is involved in an accident on the same day that the Titanic sinks, about
no kidding.
18 hours apart.
Yeah.
And of course it didn't sink.
Right.
But you know, one of the great connections to the Great Lakes that the Titanic offers is that here is this fabulous shipwreck at the bottom of the North Atlantic. And it gets so much focus and attention in the maritime community, and yet there are 8,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. And interestingly enough, most of the shipwrecks that are in saltwater ultimately deteriorate very rapidly over decades. Here on the Great Lakes, we have shipwrecks that are 200, 300 years old that are almost in mint condition.
It's grim, so but it's almost a Great Lakes graveyard
absolutely.
You're kind of talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Carrie Soden, also the archaeological director for this new museum. Carrie, as you guys look, obviously, opening this weekend, but there's a plan in place as far as, I'm sure, down the road. You want to bring more in. You want to change things up. As any museum, you want to feature other stuff. How do you put together a plan like that, and what is on the horizon, you think?
As we went through our whole design process, there were obviously topics that we couldn't include. So we already have sort of this list of things that we're looking to do in the future. We do have a small space that can do some temporary displays or traveling exhibits, which we're already starting to look into. But you know, couple of the key things that we weren't able to feature yet that are definitely, I think, on the horizon would be fishing and commercial fishing on the Great Lakes, the small personal vessels, you know, small sailing vessels or personal watercraft. There's just so many stories out there that you can't cover it all in the amount of space that we have. So we're really looking to use this other space to kind of this community room space to bring in some other things. I mean, one of the things that we weren't able to highlight that we do have in our collection is an amazing art collection of maritime paintings from around the Great Lakes. And so that's one of the, I think, the first things that we're really looking to do in our temporary display space.
Talk about preservation.
Okay.
Obviously, the items which we saw earlier this week when photojournalist Brian Jagosinski was out at the site, and some of those pieces, where are you getting all this stuff?
A lot of it is private donations from people who worked on the lakes, whose grandparents worked on the lakes, and they've been passed down. Certainly a lot of the stuff from the 20th century, a guy who worked on the lakes and collected stuff, and he passes his away, and his wife and his kids are going, we don't know what to do with this stuff, and they call us. A lot of the shipwreck items were recovered prior to the shipwreck laws and were preserved to the best of their ability. There's a whole conservation process that has to go through for artifacts that have been underwater for a lengthy period of time.
I guess that brings to mind, as we sit here and we talk about the new National Museum, I think to myself, there's this desire now to get more stuff. So is there an effort? Do you put out the calls? Do you say, divers, listen, no. I'm not saying like just Joe Schmo over on Point Place. We want you to go snorkeling and bring up whatever you can find. But how do you put out the call to bring in more artifacts?
Why don't you address
that?
Well,
I mean, we can talk about the shipwreck side of artifacts, and then maybe Chris can talk about just the general.
Sure.
You know, the shipwrecks, at least in Ohio waters, are protected entities. They're held in trust by the state for the citizens of Ohio. It is illegal to remove anything from them without a permit. To the best of my knowledge, the state of Ohio, since they put that law in place in 1991, has approved 2 permits for any kind of recovery.
No kidding. So just preserving what's down there, huh?
Right. So most archaeologists will tell you that the best place for an artifact or a shipwreck is left where it is. There's a lot of work that goes into recovering something that's been underwater for a long time. You can't just pull it out of the water and stick it on a shelf. It has to go through a chemical process to stabilize it. For wood artifacts, it has to be bulked because the cellular structure has broken down. And so you really want to make sure that you have the capability to do that preservation, but also the capability to take care of it forever if you're going to do that kind of recovery.
Right.
So at this time, like doing an artifact, shipwreck artifact recovery, it really needs to be discussed. What is the artifact? Is it of an importance? Is it of a national importance? Does it have a story to tell? And one of the 2 permits was given to us, and we recovered a bell from a 1868 shipwreck called the Cortland, which is now on display, and was actually very exciting because
I think we saw that in some of the video.
Yeah, you probably did.
Yeah.
It was very exciting. It's an iron bell on a ship, which just didn't happen. So it ends up telling this whole other story about the builder of the ship had brought his family farm bell and put it on his very first ship he'd ever built, whereas most vessels would have some kind of bronze or copper or brass bell because they don't rust. So doing that one piece of recovery was really exciting, but also just really expanded what we knew about that particular story.
And that was in the waters of Lake Erie?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
You know, the shipwreck artifacts aside, which we defer to the state of Ohio on that, we have begun to receive a lot of phone calls and emails about people who want to donate stuff. We take a look at each one of those on a case-by-case basis, looking at the historic value of the artifact, what story it might tell. Museums sometimes collect everything, and then 30 years later, a future employee says, what were they doing collecting this? We don't have room for it. So we're very discriminating in what we accept. Yeah. And it's not, sometimes when we say no, it's not because we don't think it's a good piece.
Or worthy,
It might not be in a good enough condition because there's cost associated with that, or it might be too big. We were lucky enough to accept at the new museum a 22-ton propeller that now sits in the front of the building. Had the owner of the propeller, Interlake Steamship, said, oh, it has to be inside, we wouldn't have been able to accept it because we wouldn't have had the room for it. So there are many questions that we have to ask of a particular donation in order to ensure its proper care for future decades.
So sitting here on Sunday, Anna, let's talk about getting people down there, hours, admission prices, that kind of stuff.
Sure. On Sunday, it's from noon to 5 is the hours. Monday, we're actually closed. Tuesday through Saturday, it is from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Adults admission for in-season, which we refer to as now with the ship being open.
Yeah.
So you have access to the museum and onto the ship. Adults are $12. Children and seniors are $11. And then when the boat is not available to go on, it is 8 and 7. So that is admission. And then we also have discounts for AAA family membership or family discounts.
And as part of the plot of land where this museum sits as well, not too far from the VGCS, and seeing that in the background and the backdrop, boat slips on the site as well.
Right, there is a 75-slip marina that is, it's not managed by us personally, but it's managed by Brennan Marina, and those slips are available. We expect about 40 transient spots.
It has 75 slips, and there will be some seasonal dockage, but a lot of transient docks available.
And I have to ask in the last question, and we have all been kind of holding on the hope that the Marina District really kicks off and gets moving and rolling. You guys, another peg in that wheel, but are you hearing anything? Are you hoping as far as what's to come, what's to follow?
We actually, when we made the final decision to commit to Toledo, we had a feasibility study done. We knew of what was happening, the plans for the Marina District, but we asked our person doing the feasibility study not to consider it because we know these projects they take a long time, they're complicated. We hope, we pray that development occurs, because any development that happens on the 65 acres adjacent to us will be a benefit to us. Our feasibility study said we'll get between 40 and 65,000 visitors without any development, and so that works for us. But absolutely, if the development company sees that we're up and running and attracting people to it, maybe that will spur them on to consider speeding up their plans. I
appreciate all of you spending some time. The site to go to is inlandseas.org. If you want to learn more, the website right there, we pulled it up for you. You can learn more about the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Heck, stay offline, go down and see it there on the riverfront. It is a great facility and sure to teach hundreds of thousands of kids around Northwest Ohio and Southeastern Michigan. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Stay right there. We'll talk about getting those kids reading and why it is so important and what the Toledo Lucas County Library System is doing on making reading mobile right after this.